Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, based on your time, John. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. My name is Amit Chaudhary. I am the co-organizer of Epics Hour. And today we have a great speaker, Sebastian, with us. He's going to talk about how we can change the game of our solutioning. So let me hand over Sebastian for his introduction and the presentation.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Amit, for this quick introduction. I assume the majority of you guys were dialing in today or were watching this are familiar with me. I will keep it very short. My name is Sebastian. I'm a certified technical architect, and my primary focus nowadays is in fact coaching CTAs, as well as providing different kinds of training services to partners. Now, the topic we're talking about today, game changers, or 5 simple methods that totally change your solutioning game, is somewhat of a distilled format version of what we are touching in various aspects of the coaching program, but I find those to be extremely valuable for any Salesforce or IT professionals, so to say. Now, this presentation will be a little bit more Salesforce focused to establish the context. But ultimately, my intention is that you guys have 5 tools today coming out of this session that you can actively apply on your job and that really help you to radically transform and change your thinking. Now, before we get started with the meaty stuff, I encourage everybody to close any kind of applications that are unnecessary. Turn off the notifications. You have an hour now dedicated on a Saturday morning, make it worth. Okay? Switch on your mind, don't zone out. What we're going to talk about, I've tried to, as one says, to dumb it down, to really make it accessible, because we're going to talk about some rather complex things of how we think and how we can break this down. And just as a general suggestion, have pen and paper ready and just take notes. Avoid typing them down. Neuroscience shows that taking handwritten notes just has a better learning effect. Okay, and you're not getting distracted between switching between different screens. So as I said, I want to teach you 5 tools. I want to share those tools with you, and what those tools will help you to be more agile in your thinking. Okay, and how we're going to accomplish that. So I'm just trying to navigate because I can't see my presentation. I want you to learn how to think in models. Now, those of you who are part of the coaching program, you're probably like, oh, fuck, is he going to talk about toast again? So don't you worry, I'm not going to talk about toast, but similar modality. It will help you to become more decisive when you are solutioning, okay? And the way we are accomplishing that is by using a very simple model that I call the STAR. It will not necessarily be extremely surprising to you what we're going to cover there, because a lot of you are doing this somewhat intuitively, but the intention is to help you become more conscious about it so that you can apply it more deliberately. It will help you to become more clever when you're designing, okay, by controlling the frame and how you're looking at things. And you will see at the very basic example what a significant change that can actually mean when it comes to solutioning, and who doesn't like to be clever, okay? The other aspect is I want you to become more credible when you're communicating. I think the single most, like the area that we're working on the most as part of the coaching, as well as when you look into Melissa's group, and I saw that Melissa is here. So, hey, Melissa, thank you for all the great work, is communication. You know, so what we're going to look into is what you're learning with designing like a star, thinking in models. How can you actually turn this into a more credible way of communicating? And the last one is, how can you become more confident? So how can you think on your feet? So those are the 5 tools that we're going to discuss today: thinking in models, designing like a star, controlling the frame, talking on track, and thinking on your feet. Okay. And my ultimate goal is really to help you guys to become like Neo in the Matrix, where you can just see things. Okay. Now, what does that actually mean? The intention is by helping you become more conscious about how you're thinking, how you're solutioning, and how you're communicating and acting. You should ultimately become the hero of your own journey there. And we're going to start our journey by thinking in models. Now, what does that actually mean when you think about models? I'm pretty sure some of you are like, sure, data model of flowcharts. And by the way, I hope I'm not offending anybody by calling you stupid. That's Bill Clinton from the American campaign 1992, where he used the claim, it's the economy stupid. So no offense to anybody, okay? However, we already have models in place now when we're solutioning and when we're working with customers. We have data models, we have flowcharts, and we have system landscapes, okay? But the models that we're talking about today is mental models. So how something actually works in your mind, or how you understand something to be. And they are way more powerful than those data models and those flowcharts. But the most important thing is those are the precursors to those mentioned models. And I think one of the most stellar examples of the benefits and the power of those models was this Mr. I think everybody is familiar with Einstein. And what Einstein actually did is he would imagine himself riding on a beam of light, okay, and it would help him to develop an understanding and to model how the universe works as a result, okay. And the outcome of that was actually his very famous formula, E equals mc squared. So now if Einstein can actually figure out the universe, I'm pretty sure we can use mental models to figure out solutions and understand the customer's processes in order to solution better. Now, I don't want to be too abstract or too theoretical, which is why we're going to use a scenario for today. Okay. The scenario is pretty basic. I think everybody is familiar with the different steps. And the intention is I wanted to take something where everybody has somewhat of an understanding of it, doesn't require any previous expertise, but what we're doing is applicable to any kind of business case, any kind of scenario, okay? Process is going to be order to cash. Customer buys some products online in an online shop. Salesforce is responsible for tracking all the B2B and B2C sales, and we have an ERP system in the background. Now, before you think, oh yeah, sure, we're going to use Commerce Cloud, we're going to refrain from using Commerce Cloud or any specific tool here, because this is not about a tool, but this is where, this is just our foundation to kind of navigate the space a little bit better. So now, looking at the scenario, the question is always, where do I start? Think about you are engaging with the customer for the first time. Well, what do you actually try to accomplish? Now, what you want to accomplish, or better said, where you want to start is you want to slice the elephant. Okay, so if you look into this order to cash process, okay, or the scenario, but I said, what are different dimensions, or how could you slice that elephant? Now, intuitively, you could say, hey, it's going to be about processes. So how does the business process work? And I tell this everybody, like, if you don't understand how the process works, you don't understand your solution. It is about data. And I'm not only talking here about the data model, but I'm talking about business entities and how does information actually flow through different stages in their life cycle, taking a more functional aspect. And we had some questions the last time around functions. Just poor elephant. Yes, sorry for the elephant as well. Obviously, no elephants were hurt or any animals were hurt in the process. But the difference between process and function, the process is purely the operational aspect. It's not concerned of how it will be solved. So think about it in a way like the purest user story. A user story is always technology agnostic, or it's suggested to be technology agnostic in its purest form. The functional aspect, however, is more a combination of how do you actually implement it? How do you bring this process to life? Okay? And that's the first step, slicing that elephant into different dimensions. Here, the suggestion is process, data, and function to keep it simple, but there might be different dimensions for you to look at. What's the organizational structure of the customer? How are they interacting with outside parties? So that could be one. There could be a governance dimension, you know. Once we figured out how we're going to bring the function to life, how are we governing the process? What is the tooling dimension? What are the different tools that we need to employ? So there's no limit to how you can slice the elephant, but just think about different ways of looking at it. And Amit, I think there are 4 people in the waiting room. Do you mind actually letting them in, because I don't know how to do that without screwing up the presentation. Okay, so those are the dimensions that we're starting with. And now the question is, how can we develop a deeper understanding? Okay? I'm going to show you some very simple steps, and we're going to explore that further for the individual dimensions. The first one is actually chunking it down and breaking it into chunks. So high-level process steps, or what are the different data dimensions? Because ultimately, the way how your brain works is it works in chunks. People tend to have always the super lengthy lists, that they're trying to memorize, but instead trying to break it down into chunks, into different categories, helps us to make more sense of information. And as you will see in a moment, this is an extremely powerful approach. Step 2 is trying to visualize it. 40% of your brain capacity are dedicated to vision. So instead of thinking about lists, let's think about what are different elements, building blocks, and relationships in between. Okay. Now, some of you might recognize this image that I have taken. That's the girl from the Queen's Gambit, okay? And what the girl actually represents is an extremely powerful, or like very skillful and talented chess grandmaster. And the way she would accomplish that is by envisioning and visualizing a chess game on top of a ceiling. This is really what I'm encouraging you to do as well. Become more visual in terms of how you're thinking. And we're going to see this specifically. The other aspect of how our brain works is actually stories. Okay. Our brain is programmed to utilize stories. So try to turn it into a story flow from a certain perspective. May it be an actor, may it be a system, may it be an entity that is flowing through the different steps and instances. You will see that in my example. Okay? Once you've chunked it, visualized it, and turned it into a story, you can dig deeper. Okay? And as you will see, you will be able, or will be in a position to navigate between different dimensions and levels, and really be very specific and very narrow of how you're looking at things. And ultimately, what happens is you can actually start mixing things up. And by mixing things up, what I'm proposing is that you will be able to develop a very interactive mental model of any kind of business scenario, any kind of project that you're working on. And one of the reasons why CTAs tend to be so fast is because they are able to intuitively understand and develop an understanding of those business processes and how different elements and factors are working together. Okay. So enough talking, let's be a little bit more specific here. Let me just check. Exactly. So Melissa said this is where she started doing journey mapping and process mapping to help me create a story. Exactly. So this is kind of where we're leading with this as well, whereby I will not advocate for using any particular tool, because ultimately you want to be able to do this in your brain, or like in your mind, and then bring it down into any tool that you're choosing. So having our elephants here on the top, what we want to do is we want to establish different levels. And on the lowest level, we have our flowcharts, our system landscapes, and data models. So that's really the lowest level, so to say, in terms of where the concrete reality lives. Okay? Now the question is, what about above? And what I'm suggesting and proposing here is for us to use 3 different levels. Okay, the first one is where we're chunking, where we're creating categories. The second one is where we describe in terms of what we are visualizing and the different kinds of stories and relationships that we're coming up. So it's more about being able to fluidly describe things without going into too much detail. So think about a way of having a conversation, or going through like a list of different steps and flows that are happening. You're not necessarily dropping into the lower level details, and the lowest level obviously being explained. Now, what does that mean? We're going to see this in the context of those different dimensions. So looking at the process dimension, if I was to chunk this order to cash process down, what are some of the high level process steps that, sorry, just monitoring the chat in parallel. So on the process dimension, what are the different categories to break it down into? Now, the different categories or steps might be someone browsing the shop, checking out the order being submitted and processed before it is fulfilled and the customer gets billed. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to sketch out those high level steps without being too much concerned of what system is going to do it. Like, how is that browsing experience going to look like? I just want to have those categories, because without having those categories established, what I can then do is I can really drill down, So how does the checkout process actually work? What are the different steps that are involved, And we'll try to really keep those different those different levels separate. And those are certainly fluid, so it doesn't necessarily, sorry, not fluid, but dynamic. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't change it or adopt. Yeah, it's not about being rigid, but being very agile and very fluid in your thinking. Okay, and what you can do now is, once you have an understanding of those different steps, you can actually think about, hey, when they enter their contact and address information, how's that form going to look like? And this is so incredibly important, guys. I see this so often when I do coaching sessions. It's like, so how do you see this working? And people have either not really thought about how the user experience is going to look like, or what the dependencies are going to be, because they haven't visualized it. They haven't really thought about it. But one of my favorite examples is, we have one scenario in the program where there's an existing web shop, and the suggestion, or there are two options: either you retain the web shop or you don't. And you build it in Salesforce. Now, some of those were actually suggesting to retain the web shop, are still suggesting to use an address validation in Salesforce for the order without really building that connection. By visualizing it, it helps you. Same thing is, hey, how does this process of selecting the payment method actually look like? And I will use my personal experience from being a consumer and actually buying a product online, in order to make sense of it, or we'll start making assumptions. But here, it is important to really visualize it, and there are different practices that you can utilize for that. Now, to drill down a little bit deeper, okay, the last step, processing the payment, how does that look like? And now, in the explain stage, I really drop down into what are the different payment methods. There might be the ability to pay by invoice. I might have a credit line, or as I called it here, balance. Or there might be a credit card payment process. What are the different logical steps that I have to go through? But I'm not concerned with those details on either the level one, where I'm chunking the information into steps, or like high level process steps, or where I describe it. And the reason why I don't do that is because if I start mixing all this stuff up, it becomes super confusing. You can't really think clearly there. And if you continue your path, you can actually now expand your thinking. Now, what I'm trying here to do is to visualize a thought process, or my personal thought process. I can only encourage you to try this out for yourself, okay, and practice and see what works for you. But what I can tell you is, it works incredibly well for me, okay, and for a lot of other people who have now started to try this. So this is the process dimension. We looked into how to break this into process steps, high-level process steps, then describing those individual steps, thinking about how to visualize it, and then really dropping down into the lower level. Now, the next dimension I would like to explore is data. So if you were to chunk this order to cash process data dimensions down, what do you think would be those different domains? And just as a quick caveat, I'm trying to avoid specific enterprise architecture terminology, because I appreciate that not everybody here on the call might have a sufficient experience in enterprise architecture, and I wanted to make this as as accessible to everybody as possible. Okay, so that also means that if I'm using an enterprise and architecture term, not in the purest sense of form, please, please turn the alarm bells down. There's a method to the madness there. Okay, but now let's look into the data dimensions. Now, if I'm chunking it down, we're probably landing somewhere with customers. We have order data, we have product data, and we have financial data. And I spoke about turning this into a story. Now, if you were to turn this into a story, you can connect those. Customers place orders for products which are built by the finance department or that are built by finance. What I'm now starting to do is I'm utilizing my inclination or my brain's tendency to utilize stories to make more sense of it. Now, if I start describing it, how would this look like? I can use something similar to a business entity model, where instead of going right into the Salesforce EAD, I'm actually thinking about what are the different building blocks here. Oh, I have business customers, we're placing orders, we're fulfilling those orders through shipments. Those orders are in fact for products, and at some point we need to send out the invoice. Okay, this is in a way super simple, and this is really where the beauty is coming from. This is not about creating the most sophisticated mental models and ideas, but simplicity is what trumps complexity every time, every day. Okay, and you can go as complex as you want once you have established a simplistic understanding. What you can also do is with this description, you can turn this into a story. The evolutionary story of the order. It's born in the cart, it turns into an order in the end, becomes a shipment, and ultimately ends up as an invoice. Using storytelling as a vehicle and a device of making sense, of creating meaning, is really where you can start excelling. Okay? And of course, you can go more complex, include more details, but important thing here is also to recognize ultimately on this describe level, especially for data dimensions, this is how your brain works. Your brain doesn't think about the EAD, but your brain actually thinks about the different entities. What a lot of people, however, do is they just look at the EAD, and also very often they simply narrate the boxes when they're explaining their EAD, instead of actually providing like this more fine-tuned or refined story. I see this very, very often with people that are preparing for the CTA exam. They don't really provide the context. Simply we're going to use account and contact and account contact roles and the order and order line item. That doesn't tell you anything. So data dimension, try to establish the different domains. Use business entity models with like fluid relationships that will help you to gain understanding. Not only understanding, but will help you to create a more refined EAD. And as you will see in talk tracks, like having the second level understanding, this describe understanding, will help you to make it easier to develop your talk tracks. Now, the third one and the last one for our models thinking is the functional dimension. Similar to the previous 2 dimensions, data and process, the functional dimensions we can also chunk or put into categories. So what are the main functional areas and domains that come to your mind? Given the simplicity of this scenario, I think it's pretty straightforward that we have something like sales, the sales domain, the fulfillment, and the finance domain. Okay. If you're working with customers with an enterprise architecture team, they most likely already have something like that in place that you can rely on. If not, it's even more important for you to actually be able to create those different kinds of categories in your thought process. Now, step 2. We're going into describe, and with the describe, what I would encourage you is to think about what are different core functionalities or capabilities, that will enable you to fulfill the function of sales. Dameda, you're asking if I can repeat the previous slides about the data model. For the sake of time, I won't, because we are also going to talk about the data model as part of the talk tracks. Okay. However, if you have any further questions, we can cover this as part of QA. So think about different core functionalities that are essential in order to fulfill this function. For sales, you need a product catalog because you have an online shop. You actually need to have a checkout process or functionality to facilitate that. You need to handle payments. You need to manage customers and order management. Now, if you're using, or like if you're building purely on Salesforce, you can easily map this to different kinds of Salesforce products and features already. But especially when you're working across multiple systems, that becomes more challenging. And being able to create those different capabilities and functional areas is super important. Now, how can you turn this into a story or into something more meaningful than simply boxes? You can actually start looking of how does the information flow between those different functional elements, you know? So from the checkout process, the order goes into the order management, which is then sent to the logistics team, okay? Logistics needs to check with the inventory if it is actually available in order to fulfill. And once it is fulfilled, it is handed over to the finance department for the billing process. Now, of course, this is a very simple process. But what you can then do is you can start applying different scenarios. What if a product is temporarily out of stock? Are you able to check it out? Do you want to show this to the customer? You know, what kind of connections do you need to establish between those different building blocks? Okay, so the inventory probably has like an understanding of what's the current stock level. So I need to make this available to the product catalog or to the checkout process. Black Friday is just around the corner. So how are you going to handle peak times? Now, if you're using Salesforce, obviously that makes it a little bit easier to scale the underlying technology. But still, how are you going to design your solution and able to scale and to support peak load, you know? So since I'm running the majority of stuff on Salesforce, that's going to be easy, but is my logistics system going to be able to manage that kind of data loads in real time, or do I need to move into more asynchronous process? This is really where you start becoming more clever, because you're starting to ask the right questions. You're developing the right scenarios that you can apply to your models and your thinking. Okay. Now, I've chunked it into those different functional domains. I'm able to describe how the different building blocks within those domains are interacting with each other. And now I can actually turn this into a system landscape, for instance. Okay. How do they fit together? I have Shopify, which is going to facilitate my web shop experience, my e-commerce experience, going to Salesforce for customer and order management. Okay. Again, very simple. Just imagine how powerful this can be if you have something more complex. It doesn't matter if it's across multiple systems or within Salesforce as a single platform. What you can also start doing is you can actually start developing an understanding or an idea of how you're going to handle your integration architecture. How is data going to specifically flow? Now you can here see an exemplary sequence diagram. I'm not bothered or concerned with the details of those integrations on the describe level, because that will hinder my ability to think agile and more fluidly. And you can add a multitude of different things here. Good. So that's thinking in models. What we have done is we really looked into how can we develop different kinds of mental models that are relevant for different scenarios, projects, and contexts. First one is slicing the elephant, okay? Establishing what are the dimensions that you want to look into. And for each dimension, try to chunk it. You can find categories, find buckets of information. Learn to describe those different buckets without being concerned with the low-level details, but then being able to drop into explain and provide those necessary details. Now, here are a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate that this might be quite a lot. Okay, so I see your question. I'm going to come to that in a second, but I want to share with you how you can make this more accessible. So first of all, don't overthink. Okay. So what I'm proposing here is a very loose framework of how you can develop those models. Okay. If you try to overthink, if you try to make it too complex, you're just limiting your ability. You need to learn to accept uncertainty. Okay. I think that's one of the things that most people preparing for CTA feel rather uncomfortable with, because the scenarios don't provide enough context. There's no way to validate your assumptions. So you have to deal with uncertainty. It's similar here. And it's important to choose your battles wisely. Don't get hung up. If you can't figure something out, maybe on the scribe, just park it, treat it as like a black box. And also appreciate that you're going to make mistakes. Okay, so Sai, your question is, some people utilize concepts like BPMN as mental models. Can those go into level 3, into 3 levels of chunk, describe, and explain? It depends on how detailed you're drawing that BPM. If you have like logical branching in there, I would certainly have it on level 3. And to be honest, for me, any kind of specific framework, or like a method such as UML, BPMN, EADs, and so on, they always live on level 3, because that's the end product of your understanding. I hope that makes sense. So if you guys are okay, I would like to continue with the second model, unless there are some super urgent or pressing questions that you would like to bring up now. If so, use the chat function here. Good. So in the meantime, let's talk about what it means to design like a star. Let's introduce an additional requirement. And the requirement being, hey, the customer has to fill out a delivery installation form for the professional services team. So they need to, they're going to provide a value add service to the customer, obviously, and they need to capture some information. And for a lot of people, it's like, oh, hell, of course, that's going to be a ScreenFlow. It's the easiest way we can capture that information. Now, what has happened is you have read a requirement, you heard a requirement, and you instantly went to a solution. You took a very intuitive approach. Question is, are you able to articulate what were the objectives that your solution proposal meets? What were the considerations that have actually led you to suggesting ScreenFlow as a solution? And what were the underlying assumptions that you had to make in order to use a ScreenFlow? Now, I appreciate for the sake of this example, it's very basic. Okay, and I assume some of you are able to articulate that. And it's not that you go from requirement to objectives to considerations and assumptions in order to arrive at a solution, because the reality looks more like this. We hear requirement, we come up with a couple of solution options, then we start reverse engineering the objectives, or like we're trying to figure out the objectives in order to see what assumptions do we have to make, etc. So this is really all over the place. And now what I would like to do with you guys is just look into a couple of those different specifics, with the intention of encouraging you to become more conscious of it. And not only that, but start developing a catalog of different things that are relevant and important. Okay. And I think one of the most essential tools that a CTA has, or an experienced architect, is a predefined set of considerations and assumptions that are applicable to a multitude of different solution options, which they can use in combination with those objectives to choose the most optimal solution. Okay, and that's not something that just happens in one day, but that's really something that has been learned, practiced over time. So let's look into this now. Okay, our requirement is they need to fill out the form. Naturally, our mind comes up with like 3 different options. Hey, we could use ScreenFlow, we could use Lightning Web Component, we could use a survey application, easygoing. Now for those 3 different options, what are some of the considerations that we need to make in order to choose the right option? The number of fields is of course relevant. What's the user experience going to be? I mean, I think we can all agree that Salesforce service is not the most user-friendly solution. And what's the complexity that is actually underpinning this particular form they're looking for? So the next thing is we need to start making assumptions, or we need to check the facts for our consideration. So let's assume we have only 5 fields, and the logic is relatively simple. Now, what are the objectives that will help us to decide what to do? Oh, we want to ensure a good user experience because ultimately this is a functionality exposed to B2B and B2C customers. And of course, the holy grail of Salesforce Salesforce projects, click not code. Now, that makes it relatively easy for us to confirm our assumption of using ScreenFlow. Okay, and I will say in the majority of cases, your intuition will be right, or has a high probability of being correct. But only if you're able to really reverse engineer what were the objectives that have considered the considerations themselves and the assumptions, you know if this is correct. Now, the way how I would use this is also applying different weights to it. So for instance, how critical are those objectives? For instance, click not code. If your solution does not have a single line of code, this is probably a very critical objective because you want to avoid now just introducing different way of solving it, making your solution more complex. Your considerations, how relevant are they going to be? And how valid are the assumptions that you're making? So criticality for your objectives, relevance for your considerations, and validity for your assumptions. Now let's make this a little bit more interesting by going back to the customer and telling them we're going to use ScreenFlow. But the customer is like, yeah, but instead of five fields, the form actually has 30 different inputs. Now we could say, hey, that was actually bad analysis leading up to the decision process, but sometimes we're simply hit with facts after we have designed something. Now, with that reality settling in, what we are thinking is like, oh, holy shit, using Flow with 30 different inputs is probably going to be a pretty bad UX. Now, what's the solution going to be? Of course, the intuitive answer is going to be, oh, let's build a Lightning Web Component. Okay, what the heck? And this is where I would like you to introduce, you to the concept of controlling frame. Now, what does it actually mean, controlling the frame or framing something? You know how sometimes you can't really see the forest for the trees? The thing is, maybe it depends on how you're looking at it. So let's take a tree as an example for framing. We want to change of how we're looking at this tree in order to get a different perspective and a fresh perspective that can help us to solve a problem, for instance, differently. But here for the tree, how could the tree look like when the sun is shining? Okay, cool. So the sun is breaking through. What if it was a drawing by Picasso? It's probably going to look like this. And to be honest, I think that's more Pollock than Picasso, but this is not an art class, so don't worry about that. Or you can ask yourself the question, hey, why is it a tree at all? Why is it not a sloth? And it's very convenient that I'm in fact in Costa Rica at this very moment, which national animal is in fact a sloth. But anyways, how is that relevant for us now when we are solutioning? Because by controlling the frame, we can actually come up with a more viable solution, maybe with a different rationale. So how could the tree look like in the sun? Okay, what if this was a Picasso, or why at all? We can use those kind of questions to to look into how we can create a solution with 30 inputs that can still provide a good UX. For instance, how could we get the information without a form? Is there even a necessity? You're challenging the existence of the form in the first place. What can we do to improve the user experience in Flow instead? Entering 30 inputs in a Flow is painful. Maybe we could start creating a product as part of the checkout process that already has all the predefined inputs that we need, and we can just combine it with some information from the customer profile. God knows. What if you could make the majority of those inputs optional through predefined profiles, standard values, whatever possible? Now, here's the thing: I don't know the answer to those questions, and it's not really relevant for the sake of our session here. It is about being able to change the frame of how you're looking at things. Okay, use questions such as how could, what can we do, and what if. And what you will see is by changing your perspective, you can come up with more creative and innovative solutions to different kinds of problems. And that's really where you start coming across extremely credible and clever towards the customer. And honestly, who doesn't want to, right? Good. So we spoke about thinking in models. We spoke about the star analysis and controlling the frame. Those are primarily concerned with how you think, how you analyze, and how you solution or design. Now, with all of those tools under our belt, would like to continue to talk tracks. And what do I mean with talk tracks? I'm certainly not proposing that you become someone who is simply speaking static and is going on a straight line. What you want to accomplish as a communicator is you want to be fluent. But very often people are not really thinking about how they are communicating or what to actually address. So how can we use what we have learned so far in order to develop different kinds of talk tracks? And we're going to see this here in a second. We developed a storyline. Now, those of you who are part of my coaching will recognize the template. Some of those slides, I've just taken some screenshots for simplicity. But what we want to develop is we want to develop a storyline. So how are we going to communicate and translate our solution into an understanding for the customer? And with those storylines in mind, we can now really define of what are the talking points that we want to address, with the goal to develop a certain flow, okay, to not make it feel static, but more dynamic. We want to make sure that we're speaking on point. So are we really getting across what we intend to get across? Are we providing the right details? You know, for instance, if you think about presenting a system landscape, one of my common questions is, when are you going to talk about your integrations? You know, for the CTA exam, you're expected to address, when you're talking about integrations, the trigger, the method, the pattern, what you're doing with responses and errors. But is that necessarily something that is rightly placed as part of the system landscape? Not necessarily. So really figuring out, hey, when we want to talk about something. And for a lot of you, this might come already natural. For some people, it isn't. And of course, is the information that you're providing valuable? And you're providing it at the right point in time. Okay, so let's look into another requirement to make this more accessible. So when a customer's outstanding balance exceeds their credit line, credit card payment is mandatory during checkout. Now, what does that actually mean? For those of you who have paid attention, it's like, oh, of course, I need to push the balance. And the sad reality is this is how a lot of people are explaining their solutions. This is how I'm going to solve it, but it doesn't really provide any kind of value or insights. And rather, it is a half-baked sentence. Now, the reality, however, is that every component has their talk tracks, and you can utilize the models, the mental models that you have developed and the levels associated with it in order to communicate it. So let's do a quick visit. If you were to chunk our response that we're going to bring that balance into the checkout process, how could this look like? Just high-level categories. Oh, we're going to push from the ERP the balance into Shopify in order to make this accessible as part of the checkout process. That's high level, you know, that might be like a quick response where you're providing a high-level solution just to establish that before drop into the scribe. Okay, how would the scribe look like? Oh, when a balance in the ERP system in fact changes, we're going to have a real-time integration that will push the balance information into Shopify, where a custom UI will ensure that we're going to enforce the payment via credit card if the balance exceeds the credit limit. Okay, so I'm telling more like a story. I'm still not getting lost in details of different kind of conditions or logical elements. On the lower level, I can talk about what's the trigger in the ERP system. What are different rules that will determine whether I'm going to send it immediately or if I send it asynchronously. And so as you can see, using different levels can really also help you to communicate easier, make it more understandable, because quite frankly, if you're talking to a business user, they are not necessarily going to care about the low-level details, the triggers. You know, the subject matter experts might, but the common business user may not. What you can also do is you can also talk along the stem. Okay, so what's the requirement? What do you want to achieve? What have I considered? And what are the assumptions that I have made? Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to bore you with just sending it out, but I would encourage you to kind of go back and think about for a second, if you were to bring all of these different pieces of information into a talk track for this given requirement, how could this look like? And the next one or the last one, how you can talk about data, for instance. You know, again, we can think about in different models. So let's start actually on the highest level. So our data model needs to support the process where customers can place orders for products which are built by the finance department. Okay. Now, since the majority of the data model for this process will reside in Salesforce, let's actually start looking into how we're going to process an order within Salesforce. And now what I'm doing is I'm actually taking two level one categories or chunks, one for the data dimension, one for the process dimension, and I use it to guide the conversation. Now I can combine level 2 in the data dimension to explain the ERD. Our business customers and their multiple locations will be modeled as an account within our system. Contacts such as the order contact and the financial contact will be directly associated to the account, and their role will be defined through the account contact relationship object. Now, you see the level of quality that I'm adding to my explanation simply by combining this level 2 with level 3. And every business user, as well as every technical user, will in fact understand, and not only understand, but really fully comprehend what that means and how this is implemented. And that's really how you talk on track. You use the different models that we have talked about, you figure out what's the level on which you want to talk. What are different pieces of information that you want to bring into your talk track? And of course, we looked into how to utilize the STAR model to determine what pieces of information to also include here. Good. Last but not least, and I appreciate we have 5 minutes on the hour left. So since we started due to technical problems a little bit late, I'm probably going to run like a couple of minutes over, but I have sufficient amount of time for QA where necessary. Okay. So last but not least, now that we're engaging and communicating with our customer and we're presenting our solution, sometimes we get challenges from the customer. We are being put on the spot. And this can become quite a challenge. And I see this very often, again, especially when we're doing mock scenarios with people. You're putting them on the spot when you're starting to challenge them. They're kind of falling into a state of emergency. And in those state of emergencies, when your brain just goes full power and you're not really sure what to do, if you want to fight, being the Terminator, or if you want to be the chicken and flight, what are you going to do? Now, if I had the choice, I would choose to be a robot chicken. Okay, so what does that mean? I want to make sure that the way I'm communicating and the way I'm acting is in line with the credibility and the authority that I need to transmit, but I don't want to be offensive or defensive toward the customer. Now, the problem is very often when we are in this state of emergency, when the stress and the pressure is very high, our brain can't really think clearly. The adrenaline levels just go through the roof, the heart rate is elevated, your palms get sweaty. So what I'm proposing here is an extremely simple way of how to control that situation within yourself so that you can really perform in a more optimal level and pose the right suggestions. Step one, stop whatever you're doing. So sometimes people will just start responding unreflected thoughts or streams of consciousness, that neither makes sense nor necessarily in line with what the other person has said. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that you're doing this, but again, I see this very often in high stress situations that people are kind of failing to really think through. So stop what you're doing. Okay. Step two is you want to give yourself a moment. So breathe, take a deep breath. The intention is to reduce your heartbeats, to get your stress levels a little bit down. Because if you are under severe stress, you're not really able to clearly think. And what you want to do is you want to take a moment, you want to really think through what you're going to respond. Don't rush yourself, okay? You can use delay tactics, such as taking a sip of water, repeating the question or repeating the objection that you have understood. And that really gives you a sufficient amount of time to think and reflect. Or you can simply acknowledge what was presented to you. It's like, hey, that's a good question. Let me actually think about this for a second. Okay, I need a moment to think about that. And there is like this perception of, in a lot of people, that you need to always come back with a super quick response because otherwise you wouldn't appear credible. And I totally disagree. Okay, I personally, I would consider someone who is confident enough to state that they want to think about something more deeply in order to come back with a better response as highly confident. And ultimately, you want to act. So stop what you're doing, take a deep breath, get your heart rate down and your stress levels down, and really think. Okay? Buy time, take a sip of water, delay or repeat what you've heard and acknowledge that, and ultimately act. Okay, so those were the 5 tools that that will help you to change your solutioning game. Good. Now the question is, what to do now? What to do now? So the first thing is, I'm actually going to run a pilot of the Game Changers program based on the feedback that we have gotten from the previous session. So a lot of people were like, hey, I really like this. And I kind of want to practice this more and learn more. So you're welcome to consider joining the pilot program that we're starting. Use the QR code or here, bit.ly, game-changers-pilot.com. However, it doesn't really matter if you join the pilot or not. The important thing is that you really sit down and reflect on what you have learned today. Okay. So I just need to switch the presentation now. Think about and reflect what you have learned today. How can you apply this to your very own role. Okay, go and reverse engineer different experiences that you had. How can you use the tools? How could you have done it better? Okay, and with that, I'm concluding my presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer any kind of questions that you might have. I mean, Amit, I believe you're going to upload this to the YouTube channel in, at some point,
Yep.
yeah? So
Yep.
how can
It will be-
people get notified about that?
So if anybody have any question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question directly.
Mhm. Okay, so either people are talking on mute or, oh yeah, Sai. I see you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, Sebastian. So the last part which you just mentioned, right, about the thinking on your feet, like you made it sound like so easy. It's like stop, breathe, think, and you can act as well. But there are situations like where you are with the customers in the real world. We have come up with the design, we have come up with discovery and everything, and there are requirements, right, that comes up.
Yeah.
And it needs a way to think about it. And there are expectations where I think that there are expectations where you want to give it out right away. How in those scenarios, how do you tackle that? How do you come up with a answer that is not offending, as you said earlier, but at the same time it gives time to go back and think about it?
Okay, good. So first of all, yes, you're right. I made this sound pretty easy. See, this is how confident I am. But obviously, like applying this in the real world is always a little bit trickier than simply stop, breathe, think, connect. Now, I think what's important is first of all to look into the context. And when I say look into the context, now, does the customer have certain expectations of you responding an immediate response? Providing an immediate response. Is that really necessary, or is it even sensible? Because what they have brought up requires significant changes to what you have designed, and trying to just throw like a response out to satisfy their expectation is not necessarily something helpful. And I would really state this, it's like, hey, I appreciate that you might be expecting like an immediate response, but I really need, I need to go back, like I need to take this away and really look into what the impact means. Okay, now they may not be satisfied with that, and you can then provide like some of the ideas that are coming to your mind, okay, or describe what's the impact going to be. So we had this example of where is it? Yeah, the form now having 30 inputs. You can say, hey, listen, like I appreciate the form has 30 instead of 5 inputs. Now we're going to have a couple of solution options, but in order to provide you with the most sensible recommendation, I really need to take this away. Okay, but here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to come back with. So that would be a way to address that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And if I may add something to that from my personal experience, sometimes it also depends. What I've seen is it also depends on the personality of the person who's challenging you. So in certain situations, like there might be someone senior from the customer side who might be challenging you. And even though like that that challenge may not be valid, or what you have proposed is actually correct, you have to word it in such a way that it makes it sound like they are onto something and that you are actually in fact agreeing.
Yeah.
And you're like not like completely opposing them and saying no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
In the interest of continuing the conversation.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there's a necessity to recognize what they're asking for is viable, and that you're appreciating the input. So thank you very much, Suraj, for that suggestion.
Yep, absolutely. And
Suraj, because Prakash had a really good comment. So everybody, I would suggest having a look into the chat, because what Prakash, I hope I pronounced it correctly, suggested as a mnemonic is remember PDF, process data and function as dimensions, and CDE, chunk, describe and explain. So I find this very valuable. Thank you very much for sharing that. And now, Suraj, please tell me.
Sorry, Seb, that's a great tip, Prakash. Thank you. Quick question on the integration piece that you were talking about. So you went from describing the scenario, which is to ensure that we can see the customer balance as the customer is checking out. And then you went from chunking to explaining and describing and explaining. What it seemed like you, even at the chunk stage, you kind of already zeroed in on an integration pattern, which is to make sure to bring over all of the customer balances into Shopify. You know,
It was on the Stripe level. And what I'm doing here, can you see my screen again?
yeah,
Okay, cool. So what I'm doing here on the Stripe level is less an integration, more like an information flow. Now I appreciate that in a specific application, this will become an integration. Okay. But this could also take place, it could be within the same application, you know. So you would only have to do like an automation. So I'm not really too concerned with the specific integration. It's more like, where does the necessary piece of information live within this functional dimension? Does that make
sure.
sense?
Yeah, I think this was not the slide I was referring to. The
Okay.
one that I was referring to is where you were talking about the requirement where when the customer is checking out and if they don't have enough balance, you have to mandatorily ask for a credit card. So
this one.
yep. So in the next slide where you break it down into CDE, that you arrived at the on balance change RT plus custom UI.
Yeah.
So is there a step in between that you can follow, some kind of model that you can follow to arrive at the right integration pattern to use? It sounded like you are going like we understand, okay, we need the balance at checkout, but why not like get the balance in real time as the customer is checking out instead of bringing over all the balances into Shopify?
Of course, like here's the thing, I don't have enough context I have not provided enough context to determine if this needs to be a real-time integration from the checkout process into the ERP or vice versa. Okay. So this is purely an example, and I think there could be a valid argument to be made that you're going to do real-time integration to retrieve the balance, you know, but then one of the considerations could be, oh, but what are you going to do when you have peak times? Are you going to have like thousands and thousands of calls hitting the ERP system in parallel, you know?
Sure.
So that's where the star analysis again comes into play, where you're just like, hey, what are my considerations? Or the scenarios that we spoke about as part of the models, you know? Do I have peak, you know?
Yeah, my concern is not so much about like the model you picked. It's more about, is there a step that we should be thinking of in between chunk and describe to arrive at the right integration pattern? You know, does that make sense? So should we like insert the considerations in between chunk and describe here to arrive at the right integration pattern? Like, do these steps kind of interweave with each other?
Okay, so here's the thing. This is the talk track. So this is how you can explain your solution. Okay. This is not how you arrive at that solution. Okay, but if I can use what you provided as an input. So I would certainly kind of call out those considerations here between chunk and describe when you're transitioning, you know. So in order to enforce the credit card payments, we're going to send the balance from the ERP system to Shopify. And my consideration here was that there are going to be peak times. So that means that when the balance actually changes in the ERP system, we're going to send it out rather than making real-time call out from the checkout process into the ERP. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good contribution. So if you don't mind, I'm going to integrate this into this deck.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This session has been really informative. I really appreciate it, Sebastian. Thank you.
Cool. So my pleasure. Good. So Dharmendra, you asked me about the acronyms that are used in the data model. So ACR, OLI, PVE, and I mean, those are standard acronyms for some of the standard Salesforce objects: account contact roles, opportunity line items, and price book entries. Good. Further questions from anybody? I mean, again, guys, I have a little bit of time before I return to the last 2 days of my holiday.
Belated happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Amit. I used that yesterday just to encourage people to show up, but it was in fact my birthday, so yeah, it was not a shameless claim or attempt to get congrats.
Okay, that's a really good session, and thank you everyone for the joining, and thank you Sebastian for helping us. Still, anybody have any question? I'm posing